to all the wonderful doctors who have logged in for today's webinar hosted by Indra IVF. I, Dr. Alka, extend a very good evening. Without wasting any time, let's get to the subject right away. Ovarian stimulation is part and parcel of infertility practice. Stimulation protocols can be very mild to really aggressive ones with all the shades in between. Even after 40 years of experience in IVF, the dilemma in the mind of infertility specialist is invariably which protocol to use for which patient. Today, through this webinar, let's attempt to get over this dilemma. I introduce my team. I am Dr. Alka, who's going to moderate this session. And I introduce my team, Dr. Mayuri Asudani from Indra IVF Nagpur, Dr. Bakul Kapoor from Ludhiana, Dr. Shikha Mukhija from Gorakhpur, and Dr. Abhinay Singh from Bareilly Center. I will discuss the subject in 5 headings. Need of ovarian stimulation, different protocols, multiple follicles versus few follicles, categorization of patients, and individualization of strategies according to each category. So coming to the first section, ovarian stimulation, its need, physiology, and its clinical relevance. So in this, I'm trying to show that the live birth rate is very much related to the oocyte number. It is one of very important factors in ART cycles, as we see that the live birth rate is increasing with the increasing number of oocytes, and this is showing the relation of age to live birth rate, which is showing that as the age increases, the live birth rate falls down. So another slide to emphasize that age is one of the very important parameters in ART programs when we come to look for the outcome of a program. So this is the this is the cumulative live birth rate for patients less than 40 years of age, and this is the cumulative live birth rate for patients more than 40 years of age, which is almost half of it at any point of time, in even with increasing number of IVF cycles. This is showing relation of euploidy to age. So progressive decrease in the probability of a blastocyst being euploid with increasing female age is well known for quite some time to all of us now. So without wasting any time, we have to fasten the procedure so that we get maximized oocyte yield, which increases the chance of having euploid embryo for transfer, so that it increases the implantation rate and finally shortening the time to live birth. So coming to these terms, ovulation induction, superovulation, controlled ovarian hyperstimulation, people use it interchangeably, but it is not the condition. Ovulation induction is said when we are just inducing ovulation in an anovulatory lady with the objective of one mature follicle, with the objective of one mature follicle, while superovulation is when we are aiming for more than one follicle, which is used during IUI stimulations, and controlled ovarian hyperstimulation is used in IVF when we want multiple follicles. And this is called controlled ovarian hyperstimulation because it is under strict control of the physician. So we all know this graph by heart now, which decodes the interplay of FSH and LH. Here I would like to draw your attention to FSH. As we can see that FSH is gradually increasing starting right from the luteal phase of previous cycle, and it increases and attains a level which is needed to be crossed for the follicular recruitment, and it is elevated in the initial follicular phase of menstrual cycle, and we have to pay attention that it is elevated above a particular level for a very short period of time to make us understand about the FSH window. So this FSH window concept has been proposed, which is trying to stress the significance of the limited duration of FSH elevation above the threshold rather than the height of elevation of FSH for single dominant follicular selection in natural cycles. We have to understand the LH also. We all know by now that two-cell, two-gonadotropin theory, that LH will act on theca cells. It will give a substrate that is androgens from the theca cells to the granulosa cells, from where the granulosa cells will synthesize estrogen. So coming to LH, it is very delicate. It is very delicate. It is having a particular window wherein it is the best, below which it is insufficient for follicular growth, and above that particular level, it is detrimental for the follicular growth. So the amount of LH activity actually necessary for normal follicle and oocyte development is unknown, but it is likely to be low, as if less than 1% of receptors are occupied, then also the LH activity is fairly good for the steroidogenesis. Now this slide is very, very important to understand the pharmacokinetics of exogenous FSH. Here, if we see this graph, these are the days of FSH, starting FSH, and this gray bar is showing the FSH threshold, which is around 8 to 12 milli-international unit. This FSH threshold needs to be crossed for follicular recruitment and continuous growth. So as we see that after we have started the FSH injection, this is day 1 of FSH injection. After 3 to 4 days of FSH injections, this level in the serum will cross the FSH threshold level, and after around 4 to 5 days, it reaches a steady state concentration. And as we can see here, this is the 7th day of FSH injection. Suppose we stop giving after 7th day, then what does happen? What effects will be seen in the serum levels? So as we can see here, that up to 24 hours, there is no change in the serum concentrations of FSH. After 24 hours, it starts falling down, and after around 48 to 72 hours, it falls below the threshold levels. So if we don't give the dose, morning dose of FSH on the day of trigger, it is not gonna affect your oocyte retrieval or your outcome of the cycle in anyways. So this is one very important thing to understand, that whatever FSH we are giving, it will show its serum concentration after 3 to 4 days of continuous injections, and once we you have attained that steady state concentration, it will be maintained if you will keep giving the FSH injections daily. So I would like to request Dr. Shikha to tell us how a dominant follicle is selected in a natural cycle.
Thank you, Dr. Radhika. Hello, everybody. Question is, how is a dominant follicle selected in a natural cycle? So at the onset of a menstrual cycle, as we all know, there are various small antral follicles. With rise of FSH in follicular phase, these start growing. But for any follicle to get selected, it needs to cross a minimum FSH threshold. So the follicle with more FSH receptors, which is believed to have highest sensitivity and least threshold, crosses this FSH threshold first and FSH window opens. And this follicle starts to grow and thus our DF is selected. With rise of estrogen levels from this developing follicle and its negative feedback on the pituitary, FSH levels again get suppressed and this FSH window closes and all other follicles become atretic. So this opening of FSH window for a very limited duration, it ensures that only one follicle grows and all other follicles, they degenerate. So that is how a dominant follicle gets selected.
So very nicely explained by Dr. Shikha. Thank you, Dr. Shikha. Now I will call upon Dr. Mayuri. Would you please throw some light on the clinical application of this FSH window, Dr. Mayuri?
First of all, good evening to all beautiful doctors. As Dr. Shikha mentioned in the earlier slide, that a particular level of FSH is required for the formation of a dominant follicle. Now, in a spontaneous cycle, we observe that the FSH level stays above the threshold for a very small duration because the window is narrow. But as we can see that when we use exogenous gonadotropins, we widen this window so that all the follicles keep on growing. This widening of the window prevents fall of FSH levels below the threshold level till the day of trigger. So this eventually helps us getting multiple predominant follicles.
So that's very nice to be, knowing that how exogenous FSH is, widening this window. Here, I would like to emphasize this point that if you all can see my pointer, we have seen that this is the FSH concentration and this is the FSH threshold level. Suppose we increase the concentration up to this level also. So that surplus FSH which is there in the serum is not gonna help recruiting more follicles. So whatever number of follicles are there for which FSH threshold has been crossed, they will keep growing. So the duration of elevated FSH is more important than the height of elevation. Thank you so much, Dr. Mayuri. Now coming to different protocols and monitoring of them. As we can see here, there are a lot many different protocols available for normal and hyper responders, and even more so are available for poor responders. So let's not get imprisoned in this trap. Let's go straight to those protocols which are most commonly used. So this first protocol is GnRH antagonist protocol, in which we are starting FSH or HMG from day 2 or day 3 of periods. Then we have to do an ultrasound at least after 5 or 6 days of gonadotropins. And we have two ways of adding antag. One is fixed protocol, in which people add antagonist on day 5 or 6 of the stimulation, irrespective of the size of lead follicle. And the second way is a flexible protocol, wherein antagonist is added once the lead follicle has attained a size of 12 to 14 millimeters, and this antagonist is continued till the day of trigger is there. So this is a standard antagonist protocol. And long agonist protocol, we all know that the agonist is started in the luteal phase of the previous cycle, and once we have attained down regulation of pituitary, we will start FSH or HMG, whatever needed, and then we continue the agonist, and we continue the gonadotropin doses as per the individualized patient, and we continue both till the day of trigger. This is a low dose stimulation protocol what we are using at Indira. What we are doing is that we are using clomiphene citrate 100 milligram along with Gonal-f 150 international units right from the beginning of stimulation, and we keep both of these till the day of trigger. And with our personal experience, we found that sometimes patients have had a premature rupture of follicles. So we started adding antagonists when the lead follicle is at around 16 millimeters of size, and antagonist is added in the dose of 0.25 milligram only, and we give trigger when the maximum cohort of the follicle is between 20 to 22 mm. And another protocol, very noble protocol, this is called PPOS, progestin primed ovarian stimulation. In this, we are starting gonadotropin along with either medroxyprogesterone acetate 10 milligram per day, or dydrogesterone in 20 milligram per day dosages, right from the beginning of the cycle, and we continue both the drugs till the day of trigger, and ovum pickup is done as usual after 36 hours, 35 hours of trigger. So this is a noble protocol which will help cutting the cost to a great factor, and generally this is used for a higher age group patients who who have poor ovarian reserve biomarkers as well, so that they might be needing multiple stimulation for embryo accumulation. So this PPOS, progestin primed ovarian stimulation protocol, has the advantage that it is cost effective, oral route, so becomes patient friendly, and it is ideal for donor stimulation. Disadvantage is that it has an adverse effect on endometrial receptivity, so no fresh transfers can be done in patients. Drug I have already mentioned, and which dosages I have already mentioned. So now I would request Dr. Bakul, if you can please educate us about agonist and antagonist cycles. What are the pros and cons of those two protocols?
Thank you, Dr. Alkara, for the question. Good evening, all of you. See, as a practicing IVF specialist, we all have begun our career with using agonist protocol. Now we all have shifted to antagonist protocol for three good reasons. First is that it helps in shortening of the cycle length, thus reducing the time to live birth. It decreases the gonadotropin dosage, hence reducing the financial burden on the patient. And most important is that with antagonist protocol, we can use agonist trigger, which helps in preventing OHSS to the large extent. Now, because of the above reasons, antagonist protocol can be used in fertility preservation protocols as well. Now, here I would like to share my experience. When I began my career, I was really scared to read the forest plot, but now it is the easiest thing to read. See here, I would like to explain this line which is being shown. It is the line of insignificance, and this diamond which is showing, it is the ultimate result of all the studies. It can either lie to the right or to the left depending upon the efficacy. So in this forest plot, the diamond is lying on the line of insignificance, showing that the agonist and the antagonist are equally efficacious in all aspects, like the number of oocytes retrieved, the embryos formed, the live birth rate, and the pregnancy rate, except for OHSS prevention, where antagonist is the better as compared to agonist.
Perfectly said, Dr. Bakul. Now, I request Dr. Abhinay, could you please tell us how do you monitor a stimulated cycle? Do you rely on ultrasound, hormonal assay, or both?
Thank you, Dr. Alka. First of all, good evening to everybody who has joined the webinar. I hope you are keeping in good health in these times. See, we all know there are many documented ways of monitoring ovarian stimulation. And there are innumerable number of studies which have been conducted comparing these methods, such as using estrogen alone to monitor the stimulation, using estrogen along with transvaginal ultrasound, or using transvaginal ultrasound alone. Almost all of these studies have come to a similar conclusion, that, as we can see in this forest plot also, that as far as the clinical outcome is concerned, that is number of oocytes retrieved, clinical pregnancy rate, or live birth rate, all these three methods are equal in their efficacy. So we a good transvaginal scan which we do is enough for monitoring ovarian stimulation. Moreover, the ASHE 2019 guideline also comes to the same conclusion that all these methods are equal. Adding estrogen to the transvaginal ultrasound only adds to the cumbersomeness of the patient because they have to give blood samples throughout the stimulation. There is one point in time in the stimulation where we do hormonal assay, that is the progesterone level on day of trigger, just to judge that we can, if needed, we can go for fresh transfers or not. That is the only time. Otherwise, a transvaginal ultrasound is good enough to monitor the cycle.
So, Dr. Chikha, can you just educate us about any non-conventional stimulation protocols for fertility preservation?
Okay, Dr. Alka. Well, for this, we need to understand the concept that there are multiple, maybe 2-3 waves of follicles in a cycle. So these can be utilized when time is of prime importance. For example, a cancer patient wherein fertility preservation is a huge concern. Here we need to retrieve eggs as quickly as possible and cryopreserve them earlier so that patient can go ahead with her cancer treatment. So, or there may be a patient who is residing in a foreign country and has arrived at an inopportune time of a cycle. So, and she does not have time. So, in these cases also, we may go in for luteal phase stimulation if she is in luteal phase of cycle, or we may go in for a random start. That is, if she is in any other phase of cycle. And through various studies, it has been seen that these random start stimulation and luteal phase ovarian stimulation protocols are as effective as conventional early follicular phase stimulation as regard to number of total and mature oocytes retrieved and fertilization rates. According to ASHE guidelines, also no difference in efficacy in terms of oocytes retrieved, but mandatorily we have to go with a freeze-all strategy and no fresh transfers can be done. So according to ASHE, random start protocols are probably not recommended for the general IVF population, but is recommended in cases of urgent fertility preservation. That's it.
So now I will ask Dr. Bakul to educate us about why do we need multiple follicles. Coming to the next section, why do we need multiple follicles? Because now we have understood that the number of follicles and the age are the most prime important things. We need multiple follicles because Vienna Consensus laid down some competency and benchmark values suggesting that there is atresia in the whole process. So let's understand this with an example. Suppose we start with 15 follicles. I mean, you can see 15 pre-ovulatory follicles on the day of HCG. Taking that 90% retrieval rate, we have 13.5 oocytes retrieved. Out of these 13.5, if 75% are mature ones, then we are left with 10 M2 oocytes. Taking 75% fertilization rate by ICSI, we have 7.5 oocytes which will be fertilized, and out of them 60% will form day 3 embryos, giving us 4.5 embryos. Out of this 4.5, if 75 will convert into blastocysts, then we are left with 3.5 blastocysts. But then they all will not be good quality blastocysts. If we take 70% will be turning up into good quality blastocysts, then we are left with 2.5 top quality blastocysts. And keeping an average of 50% euploidy or aneuploidy rate in embryos, we are left with 1.2 euploid blastocysts at the end. And this is the best case scenario when your stimulation protocol was perfect. your dose was excellent, and you have perfectly timed the trigger, the perfect technique of OPU with good ICSI and culture conditions in IVF lab. So if we start with 15 follicles, we'll end up having 1 or 2 good euploid blastocysts. So now we understand why we need multiple follicles, because live birth rate is directly related to the number of follicles. Here we can see that the live birth rate increases as the number of follicles increases from 10 to up to 10 to 15 oocytes, which falls a little bit when the number of oocytes is more than 15. To be very particular, I would like to say that this is the case in live birth rate in fresh cycle transfers, because with increasing number of oocytes, we have supraphysiological levels of estrogen and progesterone rise. So those supraphysiological levels will make implantation difficult. But if we see the cumulative live birth rate, that is, it includes the fresh cycle transfer along with the rest all freezed embryo transfer, frozen embryo transfer. So we see that the cumulative live birth rate increases as the number of oocytes increases, even with more than 15 oocytes. So the live birth rate decreases with more than 15 oocyte only in cases of fresh cycle transfer. But when we calculate live birth rate in all the fresh and all subsequent frozen embryo transfer cycles, so it increases as the number of oocytes increase. So can we stimulate or to get maximum number of oocytes with the same standard dose? Does one size fits all? No, that is not the condition. Among many, that is not the condition, because there is a spectrum of response ranging from poor response to hyper response, mainly dependent on AMH and AFC. So many factors influence ovarian response. Out of these, age, BMI, and ovarian reserve biomarkers and smoking lifestyle will affect maximum. If we look at the ovarian reserve biomarkers, AMH and AFC are the most sensitive markers. So NICE has helped us predicting the response, ovarian response, depending on these ovarian reserve markers. What does NICE say? That if total antral follicle count is 4 or less, with an AMH of 0.8 or less, then this patient is probably going to have a poor response. While if the AFC is 16 or more, or AMH is 3.5 or more, then the expected response can be a hyper response. So starting doses, how to calculate the starting dose. So many normograms, dosograms have been constructed. Here I have shown example of one patient. The age of the patient is 30, AMH is 4, and the FSH starting dose is coming as around 150. So though this dosegram is showing too much of variation, but we need not to vary the dose so very much for every individual patient. We can broadly classify the patients, and we can decide for the starting dose. For example, if we expect a hyper response in a patient, then the initial starting dose should be 150 IU. If we expect a normal response, then the starting dose is 225. And in poor response, it is around 300 international units. I would come to that point of, when we should be adding LH. In a short while, I'll be just coming to that point. So, I would request Dr. Abhinay that what all tests do you do on day 2 of periods before starting stimulation, and what do you feel are the best predictors of ovarian response to controlled ovarian hyperstimulation?
Yes, Dr. Alka. See, before starting stimulation, aim of a ART physician, a clinician, is to predict ovarian response in the patient who is there. There are many ART centers and clinicians who are doing many tests like E2 level, P4 levels, LH, FSH, and many other tests on the day of stimulation when they start the stimulation. There are many studies which have proven time and again, and there are many consensus report on it, that AMH coupled with AFC on day 2 are the best predictors of ovarian response when they are added. And when we add the information of patient's age and BMI, we can beautifully predict the ovarian response to a fair accuracy. Therefore, conducting all these tests becomes redundant. There is a particular case in which at least we do estrogen levels, is if the patient has a follicle of more than 10 mm on day 2. If that is the case, then we have to decide whether we have to go ahead with the stimulation or we have to postpone the stimulation to the next cycle. I would like to also add a small caveat to it, that many a times we can see that there is a discrepancy on day 2 between AMH and the expected AFC. Like if the AMH is very high and AFC on day 2 on transvaginal ultrasound is not as expected, then AFC on day 2 is the most important guiding factor, and that we have to follow.
Okay, perfectly said, Dr. Abhinay. Even ASHRAE guidelines are saying that doing an baseline estradiol measurement is no recommendations can be given, but a general finding is that if day 2 estradiol level are high, then the possibility of pregnancy is low. That is, like, I can say, is an indirect marker of poor ovarian reserve. And day 2 progesterone measurement is not recommended, and AMH and AFC are the very good predictors for ovarian response. So, do you think, Dr. Shikha, do you think that pre-medication with estrogen, progesterone, or oral contraceptive pills changes the ovarian response?
Well, Dr. Alka, we all gynacs have used estrogen, progesterone time and again for scheduling cycles. And it has been proven beyond doubt that it does not have any added advantage, but it does help us in timing the cycle according to our batch or according to patient's individual needs or according to our leaves or whatever. But through various studies, it has been proven beyond doubt that estrogen, progesterone do not increase efficacy or safety, and even according to ASHRAE guidelines, they have said that their use is probably not recommended. Also, in fact, according to ASHRAE, OCT is not recommended because of reduced efficacy, as it has been seen in various studies that using OCT treatment actually causes lower pregnancy rates in fresh embryo transfer. Also here, when we are discussing this, I would also like to add another thing, that there is this very upcoming use of estrogen in luteal phase of previous cycle, that is the cycle before stimulation. It helps in reducing asynchrony, especially in higher age group patient with poor ovarian reserve. Now, how is this? We have all read that selection of dominant follicle is already done in the luteal phase of previous cycle due to gradually increasing FSH in luteal phase. When we give luteal estrogen, this rise of FSH is prevented. So we find a more synchronous cohort during stimulation. So in my practice, I prefer giving estrogen 2 mg BD starting from day 20 of the previous cycle to day 1 of the stimulation cycle, especially in poor reserve patients.
Oh, that's a very nice thing you have, introduced, that concept you have introduced today, that we can use luteal estrogen for the synchronicity of the follicles. It will not increase the antral follicle count, or it will not alter the response, but it can definitely help us in synchronizing the follicles, as I just had explained in my natural cycle FSH LH interplay. So the FSH was rising in the luteal phase of the previous cycle itself, and the exogenous estrogen given will prevent that rise, and that will help synchronizing the follicles. Thank you so very much, Dr. Shikha. Now let's come to the next section, that which stimulation protocol is most cost effective and safe. So Dr. Mayuri, would you just throw some light on this particular topic, because it is the most, it is of the most concern for most of the infertility practitioners.
Yes, ma'am. Cost effectiveness and safety is really very, very important. So we just have to think about the same, that every clinic, as I am an IVF expert, I believe that every clinic should be OHSS free clinic. And the second most important thing, that I think FET is a better option at any given point of time, providing a more natural uterine environment. And according to the predicted response for higher responders, antagonist site protocol works wonders. For normal responders, antagonist protocol can be used. For poor responders, there are many protocols, as you have already explained in the previous slide. For the poor responders, what I think works best is antagonist protocol, dual stimulation. Then the third is the minimal stimulation using clomiphene citrate with Minopure 150. I would like to commend that if higher dosage of more than 300 IU, it is not recommended in expected poor responders. And if agonist protocol, then I personally feel that if long agonist is recommended over short and ultra short agonist for a better outcome.
That was a very crisp and very brief knowledge you have given to us regarding the protocols. Now can I request Dr. Bakul to share your experience if you find any difference between recombinant FSH and HMG?
Thanks, Dr. Alka, for the question. See, whenever we choose a drug, we have certain things in mind, like it should have desired effect, it should be cost effective, patient friendly, and it's easy titration. In IVF stimulation, the desired effect is the number of retrieved oocytes and hence the live birth rate. Studies have shown that retrieved oocytes are more with recombinant FSH as compared to HMG. Now, as shown in this slide, 20% of highly purified HMG, 50% of urinary HMG is used more as compared to recombinant FSH to achieve similar results. So when the dose required is less, ultimately recombinant FSH, it becomes more cost effective as compared to HMG. Now, recombinant FSH is very patient friendly as it has no reactions which are associated with urinary HMG. And then lastly, there are issues with titration of doses required, particularly in PCO patients, which was initially not possible with 75 international unit vials of HMG, though now Minopure is being available in 1200 international unit vials, from which we can withdraw 37.5 international units. So with so many things in favor of recombinant FSH, I personally prefer it over HMG.
Okay, thank you so much. As we can see in this slide, that the total gonadotropin dose used is much lower in case of recombinant FSH. The p-value is less than 0.05 in this slide also. Dr. Abhinay, how do you decide the starting dose of stimulation?
Thank you, Dr. Alka. See, first of all, we all have to come to terms with the fact that all patients have different ovarian reserve and hence will react to the dosage of FSH or the dosage of during stimulation different. They cannot have the same standard. We cannot expect the same standard dose from every patient to a same response from the same dose. That is why tailoring the dose becomes very important for a patient, because they have different results. As it has been beautifully explained previously in your slides by you, ma'am, that a combination of AMH, AFC, BMI and patient's age can help us in predicting the ovarian response with a fair accuracy. We in our practice are using a dose of 150 IU FSH to 25 IU of FSH in standard stimulation. In patients who are expected to have hyper response, we start the dose of 150 IU RFSH, which proves to be enough. Using a dose of 300 or 350 IU or more is not going to serve any purposes. There was a slide previously in your presentation that there is a threshold of FSH. If once that is crossed, adding more FSH is not going to give us any oocytes which are not there. There is a small point which I would like to add. In patients who are over the age of 35 years, we do add a dose of LH, which is only 75 IU, and we usually prefer Menopur.
Okay, fine, Dr. Abhinay. Now coming to the next section of our talk today, we need to categorize the patient and how to do so. So we need to categorize the patient to predict the response so that individualized protocols and gonadotropins can be chosen. The most arduous group is the poor responder, for which more than 35 different criteria were there in the medical literature. So thus an internationally accepted universal definition of poor ovarian reserve was urgently needed, which was first time attempted by a group Ferraretti et al. In 2011, which was released by Eshrey as Bologna criteria, which proposed two of the three should be present to label a patient as poor responder. Either she should have previous cycle with less than 4 retrieved oocyte following maximal gonadotropin stimulation, or she has an age of more than 40 years or any other genetic or acquired risk factor for reduced ovarian reserve, or she has abnormal ovarian reserve test. But the shortcoming of Bologna was that it had placed all the fruits in the same basket. As we see here, a young patient who's having a poor ovarian reserve biomarker and who had one episode of poor response in previous cycle, and a young lady with a normal reserve with 2 episodes of poor response, and an old lady with a diminished reserve with episode of one poor response. They were all placed in the same platform. So there came Poseidon, which aimed at individualizing treatment to get euploid embryos so that the time to pregnancy is reduced, and it had to identify more homogeneous population for clinical trials. So Bologna to Poseidon, there was a shift in the thought process from poor responders to low prognosis groups. In this, he had divided the patient into 4 major groups depending on the age, ovarian biomarkers, and ovarian response in previous cycle if possible. In practical terms, he had the Poseidon criteria. It divides the patient into 2 main categories. Category 1 with unexpected poor response. This includes group 1 and 2 who had good ovarian reserve but either had poor response, that is less than 4 oocytes retrieved, or suboptimal response, that is 4 to 9 oocytes retrieved in the previous stimulation. Second category was expected poor responders, in which patients are already having poor ovarian reserve biomarkers to begin with. So these are the patients who have good ovarian reserve markers, but they still respond poorly, while group 3 and 4 were who already had poor ovarian reserve biomarkers to begin with. So some standard indices were required to determine if the ovarian reserve was properly explored during a previous ovarian stimulation or not. So one such index is FOAT, follicle output rate, which is the ratio of the pre-ovulatory follicles to the antral follicles. Let's understand this with an example. here, as we see that suppose we have 15 antral follicles to begin with, and we have 8 preovulatory follicles on the day of trigger. So this is a normal response. But if we have 15 follicles to begin with, but we land up only having 3, 6, 5, 8 follicles, then this is a hypo response. So this is a recent article which studied Ford and its implications in Poseidon criteria. It concluded, considering the lack of efficient tool to accurately evaluate ovarian hyporesponse, Ford proves to be a relevant and crucial quantitative and qualitative index that should be used in everyday practice for the care and management of hyporesponders in ART. But there was a lack of uniformity in ovarian monitoring. Ovarian monitoring as in which day to trigger, what follicular size to trigger, which trigger to be used, and the expertise in ovum pickup techniques. So these uniformities were not there. So number of oocytes retrieved was a better index to assess ovarian response. This follicle oocyte index is the number of oocytes retrieved. It is the ratio of oocytes retrieved to antral follicles. Again, let's understand it with an example. Suppose we have 15 follicles and we have 9 oocytes retrieved. So it's a good FOI. And if we have 9 follicles to begin with, 9 antral follicles to begin with, and we retrieved 5 oocytes, it's a fairly good FOI. But if we have 15 follicles and ultimately we retrieve only 7 follicles, then it is low FOI. And if we have 4 follicles, we retrieve only 1, then again it is a poor FOI, low FOI. So anything more than 50% is a normal follicle oocyte index, and anything less than 50% is low follicle oocyte index. So these two indices were used to assess the response, whether the response was properly explored in the previous cycles or not. So here I would request Dr. Shikha. Can you please help us defining hyporesponders, Dr. Shikha?
Thank you, Dr. Alka. See, generally, people use the term ovarian reserve and ovarian response interchangeably. But I would like to emphasize that is not the case. They are two different things. Let me explain. If a 35-year-old female having 7 to 8 AFC and I am getting 6 follicles, then it is not poor response. But if a young female who has 15 follicles gives only 5 follicles, she is a hyporesponder, meaning that in a female who has satisfying ovarian parameters like a good AFC, good AMH, still we see an unexpected poor or suboptimal response. That is hyporesponder. In these people, we generally see slow follicular growth, longer stimulation, greater FSH doses may be used, and eventually maybe lesser oocytes are retrieved. And this is considered to be because of less granulosa cell sensitivity to FSH, which varies from person to person and is probably genetically determined. As Dr. Alka has just discussed about FORT and FOI, these both are qualitative and quantitative markers of measuring this ovarian response to COS. I would also like to add at this time that about 15% of good normal reserve patients ultimately turn out to be hyporesponders.
Okay, so Dr. Mayuri, I would request you to tell us what is your opinion on general practices followed by clinicians for poor responders.
Dr. Alka, if we come across poor responders, the general tendency of doctors believe that in increasing the dose of FSH will yield better results in a stimulation cycle. In this slide, a worldwide survey of gonadotropin dosages on poor responders was done and was found that maximum doctors are increasing the FSH doses to even 300 and also to 600 IU per day with a thought that it will give us better outcome. But I would like to draw your attention in another study that was done in a sample size of 52 patients with an AFC less than 5. Madam, next slide, yeah. With an AFC, next slide. In this, there is a comparison of FSH dosage of 150 IU per day versus 300 IU per day. And it resulted in the same number of oocytes, same rates of cancellation, and same rate of poor prognosis and response. And the most important, same ongoing pregnancy rates. Hence, it concluded that there is no effect of high dosages of FSH making any difference in the outcome of several parameters in a poor responded patient.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mayuri, for sharing your experience. Now I'll go to the last section, which is the heart of the whole topic, that how to individualize according to each category of patient. So I would like to say that among all the patients, we expect that around 47% fall in one of the 4 Poseidon groups, and rest 53% falls in non-Poseidon groups. And we can decide the gonadotropin starting dose, and we can categorize and stratify all our stimulation protocols based on the Poseidon based categories. So first we will discuss about non-Poseidon patients. These are the patients who never had any previous stimulation, and they have normal or high ovarian biomarkers. So either they are expected high responders. So in that case, in those high expected high responders, we should individualize number of oocyte, and we have to always keep the keep a risk of OHSS in our mind. In these patients, antagonist protocol is a better protocol, and using FSH only is better. And we have a choice of GnRH trigger, agonist trigger, to prevent hyperstimulation. In case of expected normal responders, we have to individualize number of oocytes with less drugs and short treatment duration. Both agonist and antagonist can be used. We can use recombinant, or you can use HMG, and as a trigger we can give both SCG and GnRH agonist trigger. So when we are looking at the non-Poseidon group patients, here we are able to see that agonist and antagonist were equally efficacious in all the groups: general, PCOS, poor responders. They were good in all the aspects, except when coming to OHSS. As Dr. Shikha had, Dr. Bakul has explained us that this diamond is clearly lying on the this arm, which is favoring GnRH antagonist arm. So when it comes to OHSS risk, definitely antagonist is much favored. So now the next group is Poseidon groups 1 and 2. So these are the patients who had good ovarian reserve biomarkers to begin with, but they didn't respond as expected in their previous stimulation. Either they had poor response or they had suboptimal response. So what can be the reason for these patients who already have good ovarian reserve markers? One of the most important reasons can be the FSH and LH receptor polymorphism. So in that kind of patient, coming to group 1 patient where the age is favorable, they have good reserve, good quality. So what can be done for a treatment? That we use GnRH antagonist, and we prefer recombinant FSH in this group over the urinary or highly purified minotropins, and we can increase the recombinant FSH dose to begin with, and we think of supplementing LH. While group 2 patients, that is, they are age more than 35 years with good reserve, but age being more than 35 years, so poor quality in view of increased chances of aneuploidies in the embryo. So we can use GnRH antagonist. We can increase a recombinant FSH dose to begin with, and we supplement LH for these patients, and we can consider even duostim to accumulate the embryos. Now coming to Poseidon group 3 and 4, these are the ones who have low ovarian reserve biomarkers to begin with. So group 3 is a patient who is having age less than 35 years. It has poor reserve but good quality. So what can be done for this? That we can use either GnRH long agonist protocol, or we can use GnRH antagonist protocol, as these people are having poor reserve. So we may need duostim to accumulate the embryos, and we have to increase the starting dose to 300 IU, and we might use adjuvants like androgens, growth hormone, because the reserve is low to begin with. Coming to group 4 patients, which is the most common group we are encountering nowadays. A reason being either patients are delaying their pregnancy, or they come to us very late when they have tried and failed they have tried everything and they failed in it. So this is the group which is more than 35 years of age and who have already poor ovarian reserve biomarkers. So in these kind of patient, we need to use GnRH antagonist protocol. We have to be doing sometimes even duo stimulation, and we start stimulation with 300 IU, and these are the patients we must be adding recombinant LH. And when we come to the embryo transfer strategy, we can consider a fresh embryo transfer, but we might need oocyte embryo accumulation because of the low reserve to begin with. So one cycle may not be sufficient to get a euploid embryo, and to a last resort, we can offer them, if nothing is working, then as a last resort, oocyte donation is the we are left with. So here I would usher what is dual stimulation, which I have just mentioned in my previous slide, because so far we haven't discussed about it. This is something like we are doing 2 standard antagonist cycle in one menstrual cycle. There is no difference. The first stimulation is started as in standard antagonist cycle from day 2 of period, day 2 or day 3 of periods. We start recombinant FSH or LH, as we do in standard antagonist, add antagonist as fixed or flexible protocol, give trigger. In that particular, we have to understand in this particular situation, we always use GnRH agonist trigger, and ovum pickup is done as usual after 35-36 hours of trigger. Now the second stimulation is started after 5 days of pickup, and again we start with the same gonadotropins, and we add same antagonist, we give same GnRH agonist triggers, we are doing the same pickup. So it is something like we are doing 2 antagonist cycle in one menstrual cycle. So to summarize, what do we have to address poor responders? First is that we can increase the starting dose of FSH. We have to be using antagonist protocol, and we have to supplement LH, and adjuvants like DHEA, testosterone, aspirin, sildenafil, indomethacin, they might be used for these kind of patients. So I have just mentioned about these adjuvant therapies, but the talk will not be complete if we don't look for what ASHRAE 2019 guidelines say, that they don't recommend any of these adjuvant therapies in these kind of patient, except when when we are concerned about hyperstimulation where metformin is useful. So here I would like to ask I would like to ask Dr. Bakul, what should be the prime concern by stimulating a hyperresponder and a normal responder?
Yes, Dr. Alka. Our prime concern while stimulating hyperresponder is that we have to use such protocol and gonadotropin dose that would fully control the cycle, minimizing complications like OHSs and individualizing the oocyte yield. And tag protocol with agonist trigger and with freeze all is the best policy to prevent OHSs in hyperresponders. In normal responders, our main aim is to maximize the chance of pregnancy by individualizing the oocyte number, reducing the cycle length, and hence the cost. Either antagonist or agonist protocol can be used in normal responders.
Okay, great. Dr. Abhinay, would you just help us understanding that which category of patient would you like to give LH supplementation in ovarian stimulations? This is a very delicate question, Dr. Abhinay, I'm asking you, because this is one of the questions which keeps echoing in our head, when to supplement LH.
Yes, doctor, and definitely a very controversial one also.
Yeah.
See, there are basically three group of patients in which we can use LH supplementation. If we categorize them, the first ones will be poor responders. These are the patients in which either we have a prior history of poor ovarian response, or if we have already categorized them according to Poseidon, they will be Poseidon group 1, 3, and 4. In the second group of patients, in first patient, we'll be using LH from day 1 itself. The second group of patients is hyperresponders. These are the patients who have shown normal follicular growth from day 1 to day 7 on recombinant FSH or HMG. And from day 7 onwards, they have shown a plateau and the follicles do not grow as expected. These can be termed as hyporesponders. And in these patients specifically, instead of raising the dose of FSH in expectation of getting more follicular growth, adding LH from days 8, day 9 onwards is a better technique. The last group of patients are the slow responders, in which if we have a data of previous stimulation cycles and they have had history of needing more than 3,000 international units of FSH in total stimulation, then in these patients also we can use LH from day 1 itself. So these are the three group of patients thank you.
Okay, so let me summarize this, that addition of LH is actually, retrospectively, we are all very intelligent. So if we have a history wherein we know that the patient has not responded well, this is wrongly written 1, 3 and 4, actually it is 1, 2 and 4. I believe these are the patients where we should be, adding LH. Where we know that the patient has not responded well. Then second point is that whenever the age is more than 35 years, these are the higher age group patient, there we have to add the LH, where we know that from day 1 itself we should be adding LH in these group of patients. Then we have one more situation where we know that in the previous cycle the patient needed a high dose FSH and a prolonged stimulation. So that is the patient we will add LH from day 1 of stimulation. But suppose there is a patient who is having, this is her first ovarian stimulation cycle, and her response was fairly good to begin with. From day 1 to day 7, she had shown a normal follicular recruitment. But when you do an ultrasound on day 5, 6, those day 6, 7, 8 types, there you see there is a stenting of follicular growth. There is a plateau. So to revive this particular cycle, rather than increasing FSH dose, this is the time we can add LH to revive this particular cycle, the present cycle. So these are the group of patients where we should be adding LH. Now, Dr. Shikha, can you? So this is another slide which is supporting our statement that this is the diamond which is lying on the right side of this line of significance, and this is the arm which is supporting use of FSH and LH, and we get more oocyte numbers. And this is the FSH plus LH arm, which is showing that the implantation rate was more in these patients. So, Dr. Shikha, would you just help us understanding that in your clinical practice, when do you cancel a cycle?
Well, Dr. Alka, generally we cancel IVF cycle for poor ovarian response. Maybe I'm seeing less than 3 follicles growing, because then I'm thinking that maybe there are chances of poor oocyte retrieval and thereby reduced pregnancy rates. But again, I would like to emphasize that even in poor response, the pregnancy rates are not zero. So when I encounter such a situation when 3 or lesser follicles are growing, I would not directly cancel. I would first counsel patient and maybe tell about the option of ovum donation. But I will make decision individualized to patient needs. If she wants to take chances with self-egg, she is most welcome. Because I have seen, and I think others have also seen, that probably that even with 3 oocytes retrieved, we may get a good blastocyst. So so she should be allowed to continue if she wants to. On the other hand, if a patient has like 3-4 AFC, but even with 5-6 doses, I see absolutely no growth, I do cancel a cycle and again discuss with patient. If she still wants to try self in next cycle, I will revise my protocol in next cycle and re-stimulate her. And I personally feel that cancellation is a sensitive issue, and such decisions should be taken after proper counseling and should be individualized to different patients.
So perfectly said, Dr. Shekhar. So counseling is very important. There is no strict, demarcation that below this we must cancel the cycle. And rightly said, if there is no response at all, then we'll have to definitely cancel that cycle. So Dr. Bakul or Dr. Mayuri, do you think that changing the dose during stimulation helps?
Dr. Alka, changing too many doses is not a very good idea. As Dr. Abhinay has wonderfully explained about when and which day of stimulation cycle LH supplementation is required to have better outcomes in terms of oocyte retrieval, maturation of oocytes, its implantation rates, and finally its clinical pregnancy rates. I would like to add that whatever dose you change, it will show its effects only after 2 or 3 days in any stimulation cycle. So if we can change any dose in the later days of stimulation, say around 8th, 9th or 10th day, by that time, it shows its prime effect around the time of trigger. So one-time dose changing is recommended, preferably around 5th, 6th or 7th day of stimulation, to yield us better results in terms of safety and efficacy.
Okay, perfectly said. So you say that people who have been changing every second day, third day dose is not going to give any effect, because by the time it shows its effect, you are changing again. So if at all you have to change a dose, it's a better idea you change it either on the 5th or 6th day of stimulation. Perfect. So Dr. Bakul, is addition of adjuvants in ovarian stimulation meaningful in terms of efficacy and safety?
Thank you, Dr. Alka, for the question. See, number of studies have discussed and investigated the role of adjuvants like DHEA, growth hormone, testosterone gel, metformin, etc., but with no conclusion. And DHEA has been in controversy for quite some time. Many studies were done on DHEA, and many different dosages and durations were also tried, like some for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and up to 12 weeks. Few studies found them useful and few found them useless. So no final conclusion was there. And same is the condition with growth hormone and metformin regarding their efficacy and safety in IVF cycle. ESHRE also does not recommend use of any adjuvant, though role of metformin before and during IVF stimulation has been proven beneficial in preventing OHS.
Yeah, rightly said. So even aspirin is, proven efficacious in preventing OHSS.
Yes,
Thank you,
right.
Dr. Bakul. Yes, yes. So, Dr. Abhinay, this is something which every infertility practitioner, infertility specialist, is scared of, OHSS. So I would like you to tell us what all do you do to make your clinic OHSS free?
Thank you, Dr. Alka. As rightly pointed out by you, it is every ART clinician's nightmare. And everyone would like to aim to make their practice, infertility practice, to be OHSS free. This is the very reason why preventing OHSS should begin right from the day the patient presents at our clinic. Before starting stimulation, it is very important to preemptively predict high-risk patients who can land or who have higher chances of landing into OHSS. These are the patients who are hyper-responders, patients with PCOS. In these patients, we can aim for submaximal stimulation. Submaximal stimulation is that we do not go for the maximum number of oocytes, the maximum number of oocytes which are seen on the AFC on day 2. See, it has been proven that the live birth rate increases progressively with the number of the oocytes. But this relation holds true only up to a particular number of oocytes. If we are obtaining more than 15 number of oocytes, then there is no difference in live birth rate if we consider fresh embryo transfers. Also, in these patients, we opt for GnRH agonist triggers. GnRH agonist trigger is a boon for ART clinician, and it has a capability of reducing OHSS incidence to practically zero in these high-risk patients.
So, women expected to be hyper responders, what is the best approach? The best approach is submaximal ovarian stimulation, GnRH antagonist protocol, GnRH agonist trigger, and freeze-all strategy. These all things will help us preventing OHSS, and we can make our clinic OHSS free, because as we see here in the agonist triggering arm, the incidence of OHSS is 0%. So to conclude my talk today, only female age and number of oocytes can predict live birth rate. Poseidon criteria offer the possibility to refine the stratification of patient undergoing ART using age, number of oocyte, and ovarian reserve biomarkers. Increasing oocyte yield is an opportunity to have more euploid embryos with a positive effect on implantation and cumulative pregnancy rates. It is important to use the right FSH preparation and starting dose, with the possibility to adapt the dose during the cycle to optimize the number of oocytes retrieved and at the same time minimize risks such as OHSS and cycle cancellation. So administration of appropriate gonadotropin dose and regime critical to allow growth of adequate number of follicles in hyperresponders, and LH supplementation should be individualized in line with modern patient handling approaches and a greater clinical benefit in hyperresponders and women aged more than 35 to 39 year age group. So I conclude my on the topic today